welcome guys. This is going to be the first Buber session. Hopefully it can be a project that sort of takes a life of its own. Today I'm sort of going to be the introducer to the whole project. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to be talking about Buber, Martin Buber. For those of you that don't know, Martin Buber is a basically Jewish philosopher. His philosophy is basically all about dialogue. One of his famous books is I and Thou. Ironically, it's very Christian, and it actually has a very funny connotation about how even though he's Jewish, a lot of Christians liked his works, and actually the Jewish people weren't really a fan of his sort of Christian tendencies with I and Thou. But anyways, we're going to be looking at an excerpt today about Who Speaks, and it's a book by Buber called Between Man and Man. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to go straight into it, right? So here Buber begins with who speaks. And so I'm just going to read this off, and then we're going to just kind of discuss and kind of try to get at what Buber is trying to say here, because I feel like Buber is actually getting at something really interesting, and there's a lot of questions that I would like to sort of explore with just this really small passage. All right, so here we go. In the signs of life which happen to us, we are addressed. Who speaks? It would not avail us to give for reply the word God if we do not give it out of that decisive hour of personal existence when we had to forget everything we imagined we knew of God, when we dared to keep nothing handed down or learned or self-contrived, no shred of knowledge, and were plunged into the night. When we rise out of it into the new life and there begin to receive the signs, what can we know of that which of him who gives them to us? Only what we experience from time to time from the signs themselves. If we name the speaker of this speech God, then it is always the God of a moment God. I will now use a gauche comparison, since I know no right one. When we really understand a poem, all we know of the poet is what we learn of him in the poem. No biographical wisdom is of value for the pure understanding of what is to be understood. The I which approaches us is the subject of this single poem. But, oops, I went a little bit too much. Oh man, I passed it. I lost it completely. Oh, here it is. But when we read other poems by the poet in the same true way, their subjects combine in all their multiplicity, completing and confirming one another, to form the one polyphony of the person's existence. In such a way, out of the givers of the signs, the speakers of the words in lived life, out of the moment gods, there arises for us with a single identity, the Lord of the voice, the one. Okay. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. And I think one of the things that sort of really pop out immediately is that Buber is making a very subtle distinction between what we call God and what we refer to as voice, as like this speaking. I almost want to say, and this is sort of an elaboration and a sort of really sort of, you could say, a creative thought, because I don't think Buber ever says this. He has his own understanding of what God is dead means. But I think we can look at this passage and we can say in a Nietzschean way, yeah, God is dead, but the voice is still alive. The voice is still there, right? We can look at Buber's addressing of whatever notion of God that we have, sure, that could be wrong. But you can't escape, I think, and I think this is the point of like Buber's work here, you can't escape that notion of what we call the voice. This very idea that we're always constantly addressed and that we have to respond in some type of way. This is sort of like really the whole summary almost. I'm not gonna say the passage itself is the summary, but it's almost like a summary of his whole work in the sense of like, we have to respond. We're always being addressed. The problem is we just don't receive. We're not actually actively receiving. We're not turning in a way that we receive. Another thing that I found really fascinating was the way Buber looks at the subject, right? It almost is like, yeah, sure, there can be a multiplicity of eyes, a subject, but this sort of combines itself in a sort of multiple voice, which is one person. But yeah, I'll sort of just leave it now to what you think, Thomas, about all that.
Well, one is, I mean, I've always been a fan of Buber. I think Buber's a really interesting contribution philosopher. I think, and actually it's funny, I'm not sure this is where Daniel got his very big parts of addressing and the big difference of explanation versus addressing. I'm sure I always felt there was a Buber-esque coloring to Daniel Boji Rose's commentary about that. So that's a big part of it. Also, this is fun because there's a lot of also, I think, colorings of some of our texts we read together, like Ibn Arabi, right? So idea of a relation to God that's beyond understanding, or excuse me, beyond thought, excuse me, that's actually a better way to put it. Also on the other notes, just we even read this together, but the voice, it's funny, there's like one mode of the voice. I'm not sure this is particularly what Buber says, but one way people can interpret the voice is one's conscience, right? So one's because consciousness is right, the kind of awareness, but then there's your conscience, which tells you what's right and wrong and nags at you with this kind of primordial force of imposition. It's literally the addressing, calling, basically calling you forth. Henry Newman talked about that a lot, the Christian thinker, the Catholic. I think he called the primordial vicar of Christ, something like in that language he was using. But the main point, and I agree with you, is this idea that reality or God is always addressing you to respond. And it's the question of how do we answer the call? And I say that because in the multiplicity of any poem, so actually like, it's actually kind of interesting. Actually, I think it's actually very powerful that Buber's using, it's not the story of one's life as a bunch of explanational narratives, right? It's not explanatory narratives, it's poetry. Poetry is a very different dimension. So I think also, I don't think it's an accident that poem is being used. And I don't think just converting it to just explanation or narrative or anything like that would do the job. Something special being said about that. But regardless, the fact that these poems and multiplicity, it's how one answers. That's the character, the showing of a character. There's, I think always the best explanation of what is character and why we need, actually reason why, think about this, in narrative, there's, in special kinds of narrative with this character being demonstrated, what's the moral of the story? The moral character, these words are not, they're not like, I don't think they're equivocal words of completely random meaning. I think they have very much analogous relationships to each other because one's character is called by how one answers the call of what life is about. And life is basically, one can interpret it as it's a multiplicity of poems. And that playing out of those poems of your character, how you will answer the call, how you're being addressed by reality, by God in this case. So as you can see, I'm kind of being a little painterly in my approach here, but I think the summarize, he's speaking particularly of and also remember the answer of a call usually happens in a moment. So that's another thing too. So it's always like that kind of in narrative, in poetry and in plot, in both cases, there's a kind of turning point. there's a moment of decision making that has to be made, a critical moment that reveals the character, that you never go back. You are defined by that now, by this choice that you made, this act that you did. Did you answer how did you address to the voice? So I think that's what is being drawn out here, and this is beyond our cognitional thoughts or notions. It's really something of a much more instantaneous, definite nature that's striking through. So those are my meditations, reflections, from the text and your interpretation.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think, because the more that I look at it, right, that his bringing up of, I think it's a very clever like combination, calling it moment God, right? That it's almost like he's saying, actually, there's almost times where we're not really responding, even though we could say non-response is responding, but there's moments where we're not being responsible for a response, you could say, really making a decision for this responding. That once we actually make this decision for responding, that's when, like, you could say that is when the real dialogue is happening. That's when God becomes this moment of you actually sort of responding back. I know with Buber's thinking, a lot of the issues are with this idea of like receiving, that we're just sort of not aware of our being addressed, but we're always being addressed. It's always there. It's always present. I'm curious, because I almost consider Buber as a religious sort of anarchist sometimes, because he was very much against this like idea of like law and so on, which he's very controversial in that ideal. But he does seem to, you're right, the poem is actually a very, he finds it sort of like off example, but it's still an example that he could give. But I still think it's actually a very good example. Because if you think about a poem, why does a poet, it's actually very interesting, right? Like when you decide to write a poem, you already feel addressed. So you're responding in that moment of the poem. It's a kind of voice that you're giving as a reply. So I really enjoyed your point there about the poem. You made me realize that the poem itself can be a form of responding back to this address. Right now, we can say, I don't want to generalize and say all poems are a sort of response back. I think that might be a little bit tricky, but I think there are moments. I mean, I don't know. Could we say that maybe somebody is responding unconsciously through a poem? I don't know. I'll leave that open there for thought. What do you think?
Well, that's the thing. Like, I appreciate you picking up this emphasis of poetry, right? Because remember, it's kind of the intention and purpose of a poet is a little different. I think a very big difference is also that, remember in the past, poetry had a truth value. It wasn't like it was this complete fabrication of non-existence. And in fact, remember, even Plato would say, oh, the poets spoke of it, the poets are the presenters of a first principle truth that the philosophers build on to build their case. There's plenty of case. So this is partly why he's, I don't know what Buber's motivations were to use that, but me kind of picking up what I'm seeing here. The act of poetry seems to draw out more universalism, a more universal principle, first, than exposition, narrative talks would do instead. It's not like poetry isn't narrative, it can be very much so, but it has a different color and nature about it, especially when you compare this to history. I mean, that's one of Aristotle's examples, right? He's going to say history is much more almost empirical because it's based on actual facts that occurred in this moment. The poetry can be more of the universal quality because it speaks of man or a reality in a universal sense. And even when it is speaking of particulars, those are exemplars, icons of a higher reality that's true in all cases. So I don't, that's why I'm kind of drawing out, I think now obviously is interesting, because that's the thing too. You know, by the way, I think what you're hinting at, Javier, is the idea of like good poetry versus bad poetry. I think that's
Yeah.
very true. Because that's the problem. It's like actually a bad poet's when it's like narcissistic, self-driven, like it's almost like the vehicle is in the way. The poet's supposed to be, everything. Remember the ion, remember the argument is made that poets are built by inspiration and by being a magnet on the stone connected to the divine. They are a vehicle who actually are not responsible for their poetry. But a
Yeah.
bad poet claims, like by their ego and narcissism, they're like saying, no, this is my shit. You know, so maybe that's why I agree. Actually, I actually agree with your hesitation about this, but maybe to draw out why you felt that hesitation was the distinction of a good poet versus bad. And the distinction is a kind of narcissistic blockage, an actual, and thus in the Buber reference, it's a I-it relation. So the poetry that is created is an I-it relation of oneself, narcissistic reflection versus an I-thou of an addressing, for example. And one last note, just I don't know if you saw the news, like, or not news, but like in the last couple of days, Shia LaBeouf, the actor, had a huge conversion to Catholicism. No, I'm Muslim, so I'm not exactly like raw team go, but in one sense I am, because the very fact that this actor literally assumed the role and actually was compelled to change because of it, I think is a very powerful message right there, in my opinion. So I just want to share that. That's what I mean by like, that's an example of a poet, an actor, literally working on a role through him. And actually its sincerity is to the point where he actually changes his understanding because of it. That's my interpretation of it. I think it's very powerful. So I'll close with that because we have a timer on now for 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know. So it seems like I can only do 40 minutes, I think. Yeah, 40 minutes. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, that's right. I was trying to make a distinction between like bad and good poetry, and I'm always hesitant about like bad and good poetry, but I think it is. I think you've nailed it correctly. It's about the attitude, the sort of direction of the poet. Because I don't want people to think like, oh, bad poetry would just sort of be like, oh, they're, I don't know, like it's like, who's an example, a modern example? What's her name? Rupi Kaur, I think her name is Rupi Kaur. She's like to me, I think she's a bad, like just horrible, right? But if we were to really talk about this, I don't think she's horrible in the sense of, I mean, I can call it this. I think it's sincere poetry, so I don't think hers is bad, but I still don't think she gets at what Buber might be talking about, right? I think if we want to talk about what Buber might be talking about, we might need to look at maybe like Walt Whitman or something, or somebody else, because there is something like the good poetry seems to have this addressing of things around the subject that already seem more than the thing, right? There's this personification of the thing that they're witnessing or seeing. And in this case, I think Buber would be like the poet is trying to describe a experience or meeting of the I and thou through this poetry. And I think that is the poet's, responding back, this sort of mutual exchange, right? So it's always, I think the poet sort of has this meeting and then writes it down and then expresses it. Like Buber says, everything eventually becomes an I-it after the meeting. So I think that's what's troublesome about poetry sometimes, is that once the poem sort of, once people start reading the poem, it can become an I-it, because they start using it and dissecting it and so on. But that's why I liked Buber's specific approach here about, we don't need to look at the sort of biographical context. Just look at the poem, meet the poem as if it was a person. To me, that's a lot more difficult. And I'm still trying to even meet this passage as just like a person, right? because like I'm still like making references to like Buber outside the passage so that we can understand the passage, but just taking this passage alone and just meeting it as a person, what does that even mean? What does that even
Well,
really
another thing
mean?
too, well, just to interject, remember, people are not exhausted by an addressing,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the fundamental point here. Human beings are mysteries that our engagement only reveals a certain aspect of it, but there's an unexhaustive quality about the engagement, right? That an analytical utility extraction is not going to do it. It's similar to what we said in the Ibn Arabic discussions, right? If you want to basically understand God by possessing him, it's impossible. It will never happen. That's where all folly comes from, is to try to understand God, to possess him. You'll never possess. God possesses you. That's not how it works. The relationship to you to God is an ultimate mystery, and every human being is a little pocket. It's a little mirror to God in that sense, to build out what that inference means from there. So that's why a good poem does have a quality of inexhaustibility that it should strike you in a way in of itself that's inexhausted. I think that's what he's getting at by that point. And that a biographical explanation, like one of the worst attacks on intellectual opponents is to psychologize them. So when they make an argument, make a statement, a claim, and then you say, oh, you're saying this because you were abused as a child. Like you basically give an explanation to dismiss away the point. This is like, you're not addressing the comments. We know that's a fallacy in argumentation, but that's an example. That's also why I think Buber's pointing out is that takes you away from the message. You can just swipe it away because you're explained by something else outside the text versus here it is in front of you and you have to confront it, and not in a way of possessing it or exhausting it, but just in relation. It's that kind of lack of depletability, which is so contrary to all of human existence right now, which is a chain reaction of consumerism, where we want to get our hit and then want the next hit, and the next hit, and the next hit. The I-it relations all over the place.
Yes. Yes, I agree. That your point on inexhaustibility, there's like this, I think that's the problem, right? Is like when we meet people or when we meet books or we meet things, we have this reduction tendency. And Buber's response is, yeah, it's that and more. It's always that and more. And the problem of meeting is always trying to acknowledge that it's always that and more. Right? That's always the problem. And this is why I always like Buber's reference to hate. He actually says hating, when you hate a person, you can only ever hate a part of a person. Which is a very good example, because I think it's very accurate actually, because it shows that, when you ask someone like, why do you hate them? They're always going to bring up a specific action or thing that they did. Mm-hmm. Right? But that's not the total person. That's never the total person. But it is something that they did. But that doesn't and so that right there, Buber's already showing that we're not meeting it. And so I think even the paradox, right, of like us dissecting the text, right, we have to understand even now, it is still that and more, right? Which I think it ultimately forces us to sort of live with a kind of question where we meet the question and we give our answer. That's like the real risk. That's like the real responsibility that I think Buber is always demanding of anybody that's addressed. And he does talk about it a little bit more in Between Man and Man, but yeah, obviously it's going to end in like 2 minutes. So I'm going to give you like a minute to reply.
Now, just the build on what you're just saying, because remember, this is we're in a quasi-theological discussion at this point, right? Because that's kind of the pretense of what's going on with I thou. Faith is super rational. It's above it. It's not the dismissal of it. What I mean by that is this kind of, on our pure rational basis, we should be all about the law, basically getting equivocation, right? Tit for tat. I get something, you get something. That's all just, right? That's all rational. Any human being anyone without faith can acknowledge that. But mercy, kind of looking beyond, seeing more, redemption, basically redemption, looking for more mercy. That's a higher order because you have to operate in a level beyond natural. And the one that I agree with this very much with the Catholics on this point, grace perfects nature, it doesn't destroy it. That's actually that's a fundamental principle of Christianity and Islam, I would say. We both acknowledge that point. So that's, oh, by the way, at least your other point, just to close on this kind of anarchist mode, is because it's a long discussion of the spirit versus the law. Which one is the relationship? And actually, that's one of the tensions, is the law is very much there, but the law is inferior to the spirit. And that's what Buber's trying to draw out. And the I-thou relation is the way of articulating it versus the I-it. But it's been a really great conversation, Javier. I really thank you for initiating this. I look forward to next week.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we got less than a minute because I didn't upgrade. So, but yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Thomas, for being here. And yeah, this will be the end of the Buber session. And hopefully we can have more in the future. All right, you guys take care.